All right, well, hello and welcome everyone to our webinar today. We're going to go ahead and get started since we're at the top of the hour. So we want to thank you for joining us today on our Organizational Standards Center of Excellence webinar on building board capacity. This is part of a three-part series. We did do a webinar last week that was on board development and kind of started talking in on board training, and we also talked about board recruitment. Gerald Crocker presented that webinar last week. He's our Director of Training and Technical Assistance at the Community Action Partnership. And today I'm going to be talking about building board capacity. So we're going to touch a little bit more on the training piece. We're also going to talk about kind of board structure, how to build up that capacity for your board, keeping your board fresh, and then we'll conclude a little bit with how to just make sure you have the right members on your board as far as thinking about term limits, removal processes, and things like that. So I'm Courtney Kohler. I'm a Senior Associate with the National Community Action Partnership, and I work with the Training and Technical Assistance team. So I'll be presenting today's webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. So we have what we're going to be doing today. Everyone's on mute, so you're not able to speak out loud on the webinar today. Just to cut down on background noise, we keep everyone muted. And then as far as the chat box goes, we do encourage you to send in questions throughout the webinar. And I do see that we have someone with a hand raised at this point. So if you could go ahead and type your question in the chat box, then we can address your question there. And what is most helpful is if you type it into, if you just want me to see the question, you can type it into all panelists or host. And then if you're wanting to just put out general comments or questions that might be relatable to the audience, you can type it into all attendees. And also, if you're having any trouble with your audio throughout the webinar, you can go to the Communicate tab up in the upper left-hand portion of your screen. Then you'll select Audio Connection, and you can adjust your audio there, or you can switch from computer to phone. Sometimes it comes through a little bit clearer on the phone if you're having audio issues. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and get started into today's webinar. Again, encourage you to type in questions as we go. We're going to be stopping and I'll address some, throughout periodic points in the webinar, and we can kind of keep engaged through doing that. So today's agenda, we're going to be talking about tips and strategies for developing your own board. We're going to be talking about board assessment, and then, of course, give you some key resources that relate to that. So just to review what we talked about last time and a few of the resources that are key to this presentation, a lot of these materials came out of a resource that was developed with the CAPLAW. So the Community Action Partnership worked with CAPLAW, our legal services national partner, and they developed this board roles and responsibilities training series. And so what it can be, there's a lot of slides in the presentation itself, but it can be split up to be used in different pieces with your board. And so it can be really helpful to kind of create your overall board training strategy by thinking through how to incorporate those different pieces of the training to deliver to your board over time. So that is available on CAPLAW's website. You can go into their resource library, and they have lots of different board governance resources, but this one is one of the newer ones, and you can just, or you can type in the search, and it's training and orientation tool for tripartite boards. Another resource, and we mentioned this last time as well, and this is the board composition matrix that CAPLAW developed. And so with this, this is something it's kind of lets you start to build out a recruitment strategy over time, so you always have that ongoing. And Jarl talked about that last Monday, about how important it is to make sure that you kind of have people in queue to add to the board over time. And so you can kind of, as you can see on this matrix, there's lots of different things that you can think through, what sector they would sit on, different pieces of diversity to make sure you have a diverse board, what their skills and experience are, their access and connections to different people within the community, and so on and so forth. So this is something that you can do to kind of prepare so you have those people ready to come on into your board, and you're always kind of listing out those who might be available to come and sit. And then also it just helps you to organize your board as far as, what kind of diverse people you have, those skills and expertise, and just making sure that you have that comprehensive, diverse board to work with. So that is available in the link, and we'll share these slides as well as the recording from this webinar also. And we'll share that on our website within the next couple of business days. Then there's these other resources here. These are a little bit older, but still very relevant. And these were developed by CAPLAW a few years ago as well. So this is a self-training tool. It has questions, quizzes, exercises, and resources within the toolkit. It's divided into 4 different parts so that the board can do it in sections. So part 1 focuses on the general tripartite board composition and selection information. So there's a facilitator packet as well as a PowerPoint for that. Part 2 talks about the public official sector of the board. Again, each piece has that facilitator packet and the PowerPoint presentation to use. And then part 3 is on the low income representative sector, and then part 4 is on the private sector. So those are available on the CAPLAW website for you to access and utilize with your board. So just a reminder that those are out there. We also talked about this recruitment matrix, and this came from BoardSource. So this is just another tool that you can use to make sure you're looking at who all's on your board, what their expertise is, and also just thinking through who could be on your board in the future as you have that recruitment strategy for your board. So that's available through this link on BoardSource, and of course you can kind of adapt that to your agency's needs and use it however you see fit. Jill also mentioned last week that we have our both a video series as well as facilitator manuals and PowerPoints on ROMA for boards. So it's actually a 7-part series. You can use it all within one series, or you can kind of use whatever parts you see fit at the time, of course, working that into your overall board training strategy. And then this one, the first one, might start with introduction for boards on ROMA, and then we have one for each part of the ROMA cycle, so assessment, planning, implementation, achievement of results, and evaluation. And then also we have one on creating a local theory of change for boards, so that's the 7 that are in that series. And this is all available on the partnership website. All of the facilitator manuals and PowerPoints are there currently. The videos were recently finalized, so those are getting posted, I believe, this week. But we also have all of this available, including the videos, right now on our Community Action Academy site. And so you can go in and access those free on-demand e-courses on each of the 7 parts of this series in Community Action Academy. And that website is moodle.communityactionpartnership.com. All right, and another resource to point out, we do have these board videos on organizational standards for board members. And so each one is really short. You can see kind of on your screen here how short they are. So some of them are even 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 56 seconds, 6 minutes, 25 seconds. So very short snippets on each category of the organizational standards, as well as kind of an overview that's about 11 minutes long. And Denise Harlow, our CEO, did those a few years ago once the organizational standards came out, but they're still very relevant to organizational standards today as well. All right, so building board capacity. Just wanted to make sure you're aware of those tools before we got started today, so that you had those kind of in your resource library as far as what you can think of and use as we're talking about building this board capacity, which does relate back to training, of course, for your board. So we talked a little bit about this last time, but the governance or board development committee, this is something we kind of recommend that each board has to make sure that you're looking at recruitment and you're always looking at filling vacancies. So these are the people on your board that are kind of charged with this task of selecting board members and filling those vacancies. It's a standing committee, so it meets throughout the year. It's not just before board elections. And it's something that kind of creates that ongoing queue of board members that you can continue to make sure you have recruited and ready to fill those vacancies when they do happen. So some other tasks that you can have this committee do, they can work with the executive director to ensure board functions are going well. You can also coordinate board orientation and training through this committee, so making sure that you're looking at that overall board training strategy, and this committee would be charged with that. Also, they would implement the board self-assessment process, and then also they could coordinate that periodic review of the governing documents. So there's a lot of different functions that this board committee can do for the board throughout over time, so that you don't look at it as just for that recruitment piece, but there's lots of things that they can do throughout the year just to make sure that the board is very strong and has that capacity. So board training, that's one thing that we want to talk about at the very beginning today. And regular board training is really important to building that board capacity. And so some of the things you want to think about as far as regular board training goes, instead of just what we suggest is that you have this board training strategy, not just throwing out board topics here and there for training over time. And as you all know, the organizational standards do require that board training happens for the board. And so the best way to do this is to have this overall strategy for your training. And establishing an advisory committee as a training ground for potential new board members is always a good idea, as well as a benefit from input of potential donors and experienced board members who may have met term limits. Many organizations will undergo a board assessment as well, which identifies the needs and functions and compare it against your current board composition. You can always use that board assessment to look at training topics as well. So you can do kind of a board training assessment to determine what types of training topics you need to train your board on. And then also, using that board self-assessment helps you to identify those gaps in both skills of the current board, as well as in the future, what types of skills and expertise you might need to look at as you recruit new board members over time. So you can focus on what might be lacking to fill that and then build that overall capacity. So another thing with board training is you want to make sure that you require all board members to attend. And so we're going to talk a little bit too about keeping your board fresh and making sure people are attending. But you want to make sure that you're not just making it an optional activity for board members to do their training, but that it's really incorporated into the regular meetings and that it's just a part of being on the board. You also want to consider ongoing concise training that's incorporated into the meetings, and so making sure that this training that you're doing is not too lengthy, that you're not just focusing on board retreats that happen over a 1 or 2 day period, but that you're trying to get those snippets of training incorporated into those meetings. So we've been working on those training materials that have been shorter videos, shorter training segments that you can provide to your board, so that it's easier to pick up those and insert them into your regular schedules. Also, certain topics such as financial statements and audits, a lot of times that's stuff that people need to know fairly soon as they join the board or need a little bit of a refresher on. And so being able to incorporate that rather than waiting until, once a year or whatever it might be is really important. So some different training topics that you might consider, mission, history, kind of getting that foundational piece of community action is always important. Also training on the programs of the agency, so board members are familiar with what goes on in the agency, what services are provided. Even though some people might think that they know kind of what the Community Action Agency does, it's always good to give an overview of that. Also the strategic direction of the agency, so training on what the strategic plan is, what that means, and where the organization is headed over the next 5 years or so. Financial oversight, so talked a little bit about that, but it's really important that board members understand their role in financial oversight as well as how to read financial statements and audits so that they can do their governance duties as far as that financial oversight goes. Organizational structure, so that they kind of understand how the organization is laid out, how many employees there are, who are the different department leads, things like that is always good for board members to know. Board composition is obviously very important for the board to understand and how that works as far as decision-making capacities and different roles and responsibilities as well. And then board operations. So this could include anything from the parliamentary actions and as well as how meetings are run, as well as kind of the big picture over time of how, the board conducts training or maybe how the board does self-assessments and things like that. So those board operations are important. So these are just some you might want to consider that are very popular often for orientation and training topics, but there's obviously many more. So community action agencies have the organizational standards, they have ROMA, and all of those things are important for board members to know as well. So boosting board engagement and retention. This is one of those training topics that comes up a lot. As far as how do we really engage our board, how do we keep people coming to the meetings, how do we retain board members over time. And so we want to talk a little bit about how to boost your board engagement and retention. So one way to do this is through a board self-assessment. So always kind of taking that critical eye on the board and letting the board do that themselves is good because it can help to kind of build that buy-in and put them in charge of their own improvement really over time. So there's lots of different benefits to doing the board assessment. It provides an opportunity to reflect on board responsibilities, both individual as well as shared responsibilities across the board. Also, it helps identify varying perceptions and opinions among board members, clarifies and manages all of those expectations that are out there, and then also acts as a platform for setting and attaining board priorities and goals. And then lastly, really helping to inspire board to work as a team and to strengthen the organization overall. So board members and boards as a whole are really starting to turn more towards board assessments as a vital governance tool. And so the self-assessment really gives the board opportunity to step back from its everyday business and address a larger, more fundamental issues that might be happening over time and in the future. And in addition to helping boards kind of reflect on how well they're meeting their responsibilities, it helps boards to focus on integral aspects of their work, from strategic direction setting, oversight, and fundraising, as well as outreach within the community. And self-assessments can also help kind of shake boards out of kind of micromanaging the organization's work and then redirect their focus to the governance issues. So it makes board members take a look at what are those things that we're supposed to be doing, where do we have skills that are built up, where is our expertise at, and then where do we need to grow in certain areas. And then it can ultimately just lead to a more engaged board and a higher performing one as boards are taking a look and self-assessing themselves. So being able to look internally in addition to assessing programs and chief executive performance is another benefit. Again, reflecting on those responsibilities. Also looking at different questions that maybe need attention over time that aren't at the top of mind. Maybe during a board meeting, it kind of forces the board to ask those questions and provides a safe space to do that in. It can also help increase teamwork and then really, again, just helping those expectations. It helps if you know what your expectations are, you're most likely to fulfill them. And so really being able to clarify, remind, and discuss those expectations can be helpful. And then also it can just help demonstrate accountability. Board assessments can, and it kind of increases that organizational value. And then lastly, another kind of side benefit is that doing board self-assessments can help display credibility to funders and other external audiences. If your board is doing those regular self-assessments, they're recorded in the minutes, others are seeing that happen. Usually that means the board is pretty intentional about the work that they're doing and the governance that they're providing to the agency. So some common board assessment areas, as you see here on your screen, I won't read through all of them, But in a really thorough self-assessment process, board members will respond to as many as a dozen different statements under headings like finance, fundraising, board recruitment, strategic direction. And when the responses are compiled, the areas of agreement among board members are just as revealing as those items with a broad range of responses. So you'll be able to see where people all agree or all disagree, and that can be very telling to kind of what's going on the board and what the different thought processes are. And then what areas you might need to focus in to grow and develop. So overall approach to self-assessment is important. So it's not a one-time deal. You want to think of the board self-assessment as a kind of a governance agenda, not a report card. So looking at it is more of an opportunity to improve rather than, kind of taking that critical look and, really being a critic to the board. You don't want to look at it as much like that. But it's really a chance to ask, how are we doing? It's an ongoing process, starting point on a journey to excellence. So if people are familiar with the Pathways to Excellence process, we always talk about how you start out with kind of the benchmark of where you're at now. Wherever that is fine, but where you can go from there is forward. And so, really using it as that place of figuring out where you're at now and then where you want to go from there. And you can also use it as a to-do list. So you can use it as, how do you build your board training strategy? Well, you can look at your board assessment and determine what training topics you might need over the course of the next year or two to build that capacity up for your next board assessment. You can also do that as far as figuring out what more intentional items that you need on your board agenda to make sure you're discussing topics that are really relevant and helpful to the governance of your agency. Then as far as this ongoing process, we keep talking about how it needs to be an ongoing process. Really even those boards that are operating at the highest levels are always fine-tuning over time. And so this kind of gives you that opportunity to be fine-tuning over time and not just continue doing what you've always done just because you've always done it that way. Also looking at the recruitment process. So this, again, ties back to that as well. Figuring out new topics for board education, new skills and expertise that the board might need, and then reviewing meeting evaluations to learn what you can do better. So you can also, conduct mini assessments or evaluations for each meeting to figure out what you kind of need to improve over time rather than just the large assessment that might happen once a year or so. Really the value of the assessment, leads to a healthy and productive discussion about board strengths and weaknesses, and then results in an agreed upon plan for building a stronger board and governance model. So that's kind of the overall goal of the self-assessment, and over time it can learn to be very valuable to the board members. All right, so here's just a picture on your screen to show an example of what a board self-assessment might look like. So if you're looking at a section on vision and mission, what board members would do is they would select their response rating, kind of where they agree or disagree or maybe don't know as far as various statements. So it might be that the organization has clearly stated vision and mission statements, and then you might rate that as, whether the board member strongly agrees or disagrees. And you can see that if you're seeing across the board that maybe they all disagree, that they're not, clearly stated vision and mission statements, then that needs to be looked at. Either the board members need to be educated on, what those vision and mission statements are, what they mean. There needs to be discussion around that, or then those vision and mission statements would need to be more developed or more clear. And so then that way you could dig deeper into that topic and, based on those responses. And then you can also see that if you have varying responses, maybe you have some that strongly agree and they were longtime board members, and then you have some that, disagree or don't know, that maybe are newer board members, then maybe that needs to be incorporated more as an orientation topic to make sure that new board members come up to speed faster on that. So there can be a number of different responses that you have based on the answers that you get on your board self-assessment. And it's really just taking that opportunity to look at how can we do better and make sure that everyone knows these different items rather than just assuming. So that's just one example. There's lots of different ones out there that can be used. This is also another way of looking at it, board procedures, best practices checklist. So you can just check here of whether the board meets at least as often as specified in the bylaws. All of these different things as far as is there sufficient notice of meetings, type of notice, etc. Kind of making sure that you're doing all of those best practices at a board, as a board, and then those ones that you're seeing across board members that are not checked. Those are ones you might want to have discussion on. How can we do better on this, and make sure that they are checked next time we assess ourselves. Or if there's varying responses, then there might just need to be that education piece that goes into, what the bylaws say, what is the, how is at least as often as our bylaws say, that sort of thing. And then here's some more examples of this best practices checklist around board composition and selection. So this is looking at kind of the tripartite representation of the board, whether 1/3 of the board are elected public officials, the low-income sector board members selected by democratic selection process. So a lot of these pieces are, in line with the organizational standards as well. And so it's always good to make sure board members are assessing themselves on this, so then the agency is more prepared when it comes to the monitoring of the organizational standards to make sure all of these items are in line. So some different logistics around board self-assessment. How often should this be performed? When is a good time for a board to conduct this? How should a board conduct one of these self-assessments? And so these are just some questions we get a lot around the logistics of these. And board self-assessment is often a pretty comprehensive process to be carried out every year. A lot of times every other year tends to be more helpful for boards, so that there's enough time in between to work through some of the items that are found on the board self-assessment. For instance, it probably doesn't make sense to embark on this process if the organization is facing a crisis or some other pressing matter that is requiring everyone's full attention, because that's going to be most of the focus of the board meetings. You probably also wouldn't want to launch into this process when staff and board leadership are at odds with one another, or when the organization or the board lack the capacity to enact on the strategies that they might develop to then improve from the self-assessment. Also during a time of transition, when there's maybe executive transition happening in the organization, that might not be the best time to do the board self-assessment. So you want to kind of make sure things are fairly stable in the organization and for the board before conducting this. Otherwise, your results are going to end up potentially skewed based on what crisis is happening at the time. Also, performance assessment can be particularly useful just before a board engages in strategic planning, or maybe if they're preparing for a major campaign, or maybe even after a major crisis. So after a big transition happens, to really set that baseline of where you're at and where you could possibly go. Another good time to do it is maybe if you feel like the board is having some complacency that's setting in. That might be a good time to give kind of an invigorating push and kind of help re-energize the board as you're looking at these different topics and education pieces. Okay, so on the process of the board self-assessment, this is kind of the process you could go through as you're looking at doing a board self-assessment. So first of all, you want to make sure you get your full board on board. And so this should really be a team effort. Real governance change or improvement is not possible if one or the other half of a half-hearted, or if there's half-hearted participants on the board. or if there are resistant participants on the board. So it's been recommended that the leadership team recruit a couple of other board members to maybe play an active role in the process and take some ownership of for seeing the assessment results translated into a governance agenda. So having a couple people that are tasked with that item, as well as, you know, making sure that you're choosing those right people, and they might come like core to an ongoing governance committee, like we talked about earlier, even if it begins kind of in an ad hoc manner for the purpose of the self-assessment. So that can be kind of a way to not only get the board self-assessment process going, but get a board governance committee going as well. So as far as the rest of the process here, of course, you want to get your full board on board. So if people are at odds or resistant, you probably want to work through that first before you begin. You want to establish that group of board members to oversee the process. Then you administer the self-assessment tool, making it, of course, accessible to all, you know, keeping that in a, you know, time-sensitive time frame to make sure people are completing it all around the same time and getting it all done. Then you would tabulate responses. A lot of times, again, on the administration of the self-assessment tool, that can be done through SurveyMonkey. So board members can have some time to do that, not necessarily in the full board meeting, because sometimes these are pretty lengthy and comprehensive, depending on the tool that you do choose. And so that can take a little bit of time for board members to really want to be able to think through the process and not kind of have the pressure of being in the meeting. But you would want to make sure that everyone has access to that. So, you know, making sure that people have internet access and knowledge and ability to complete that survey online if you are going to take that route. You can also, you know, of course, use paper self-assessment tools as well if needed. Of course, then you would want to tabulate responses. Again, SurveyMonkey can be very helpful in tabulating the responses pretty quickly and easily, kind of helping with a little bit of the analysis piece as well. Then you'd want to make sure you discuss the results as a board, not just provide a report and, you know, call it there. You'd want to make sure you have a good discussion around it. You know, talk about the strengths, the weaknesses, and then establish that realistic action plan. So making sure you're acting upon the results as well. And then making sure you're following up and reassessing. So again, not just a one-time activity, but then make sure it's on the board agenda over time. You know, maybe not every meeting, but on a regular basis to make sure that you're checking back in on those strategies that you said you're going to do to follow up on the board self-assessment, and just making sure you're continuing on in that action plan. And that's the way it's going to be most effective. So this is kind of the process you can use. You know, if you're observing any of the following, you can be certain that there are others who will welcome a discussion about improving board performance. So if you're looking at if people are having trouble with attendance and achieving a quorum, this can be a helpful process. If board members are choosing to attend other meetings over your board meetings, that might be another reason to engage in self-assessment. If board members are coming to meetings without doing any kind of preparation or reading in advance. Also looking at board members that are more active in parking lot discussions, so kind of chasing rabbits rather than, or if they're looking at, if they're talking a lot more about other items after the meeting and things like that, but they're not participating in the actual governance items of the meeting agenda. That's a little bit of a sign that you might need to conduct this self-assessment. If board members are coming early or leaving late for the board meetings. Also, if you're experiencing a lot of micromanagement by the board, kind of helping step back and refocus on what we need to be focusing on. If you're hearing repeated grumbling about the need for new board members, a self-assessment may be good. And then, you know, those are some times whenever you might think it's good to do a board self-assessment. And then, of course, just making sure that another kind of key item is making sure that results are kind of held anonymous, or that you at least discuss that up front, so that people feel fully comfortable in giving answers and then discussing afterwards. So you don't want to tag names tied to comments that might be in the board self-assessment if people are not going to be comfortable with that as you read the results. So different resources on board self-assessment, you want to decide on and use an appropriate tool or format. And this is something, that would be good to discuss to get the whole board on board, is to make sure that you are talking about the tools, agreeing on a tool, because otherwise if you're starting out with the tool itself being in disagreement, you're not likely going to get the full board on board. So these are just some different tools that are out there that can be adapted to your needs or that can be used. There's some that can be purchased. There's some that are a little bit more, easier to get for free. But these are some different ones that are out there. There's actually one that was developed by the Indiana Community Action Association that you can get off of Virtual CAP to adapt as well. There's a couple others listed here. There's one on CAPLAW website as well. And then there's lots of nonprofit associations that have some different self-assessment tools. All right, well, before going into this next piece, I'm just going to check and see if there are any questions. So just a reminder that if you do have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to type those in the chat box, and we can stop to address them kind of as we go through. All right. Well, let's go ahead and talk about building relationships and the role of the board chair. So this is another thing, the board chair is obviously very critical to, keeping that capacity of the board. Having a strong leader is always good. But we always want to make sure that the relationships and the roles are clear on, what the board does, what the executive director does, what the board chair does, etc. So the role of the board chair presides at the board meetings. So they're going to be the one that kind of, leads the board meeting and works with the executive director as well as the executive committee, if you have one, to plan the meeting agendas. And so providing that leadership both with the agenda as well as in person in the meeting. They support and act as a sounding board for the executive director. So they provide that ongoing support for the executive director. Since the board oversees the executive director and supervises them, that's very important for the board chair to take the lead on that piece. Also acting as a spokesperson for the board. So if they're given that authority by the board, they kind of are able to act as that spokesperson on behalf of the entire board. And then depending on state law and bylaws, they might appoint committee members and serve as an ex officio member of different committees. So of course, that's going to depend on your own local laws and bylaws, but that's one thing that can be done. Another role of the board chair is to work with the governance and board development committee, if you have one or if you plan to develop one, as well as the executive director to identify and recruit new board members. Also identifying board members for future leadership positions and helping to develop leadership skills. So the board chair always wants to be thinking of who could lead this board in the future. So as officers are being built up within the board, skills and expertise is being built up, making sure that the board kind of has that succession plan moving forward, that they would be able to go on without that current board chair someday very successfully. So this is a good kind of listing here of the executive director and the board chair. So kind of looking at establishing expectations. You can look at the frequency of the check-ins, what are the priorities between those expectations and check-ins, what are issues that might need to be communicated, what are the different communication styles of both the executive director and the board chair to make sure that that goes smoothly. Talking about how the board chair can provide that sounding board or feedback. and then also talking about those ways to support each other. So in the very beginning, when this relationship starts, it's very important to talk through those different things within one of the first meetings to make sure that those are transparent from the very beginning. It can also be good to just revisit these items over time as well. Communication. We always talk about that as a key. It's listed all over the slide, but you want to make sure that you have regular communication. Those communication lines are open, so people feel comfortable on both sides, executive director as well as the board chair. And then identifying and working to resolve those differences in non-defensive ways. So again, just communicating effectively, confronting when needed, but making sure that you confront in a good manner to avoid conflicts. Then also making sure that there's one-on-one meetings with board members, among other things, to find out what motivates each to serve on the board. So you want to get to know. It's important for both the executive director and the board chair to get to know what motivates each person, how do they connect with the organization's mission, especially this could be something that happens, as soon as they start serving on the board, but also you could kind of do these check-ins a little bit over time too, just to make sure that people are, getting what they need on their end, that people are still connecting to the organization's mission, and things like that. Also, figuring out what the board member hopes to gain from board service. So it's kind of a two-way relationship that happens, and making sure that the agency is getting what they need as far as the duties of the board member and the overall governance, but that the board members are getting what they need as well. Also, figuring out what they can contribute, making sure that you're not missing any talents or skills that they might have, or any connections that they have in the community. What skills or knowledge do they need or do they want to develop to become a more effective board member? A lot of times people are very willing to learn, so we just need to have these conversations to figure out what they might want to learn. And then, what can make their experience more satisfying? And so we want to make sure that usually if a board member is feeling fulfilled and satisfied on their end, they're going to be more likely to give to the organization however they might need to. So again, this is good to do upfront, but then periodic check-ins throughout board service. And then developing board members. So providing board members with opportunities to develop their skills. I already kind of talked about, usually people are willing to learn if they understand their expectations and feel useful as well. Helping board members get to know each other. So mentors can be established as new board members come on. That's a very good way to orient board members. And then also inviting board members to introduce themselves and, more than just a name, and maybe, where they're from. But really giving them a chance to kind of tell their story and tell their connection to the organization and why they are serving on the board. Also encouraging board members to be actively engaged at meetings, so seeking input from individual board members so that you're not just kind of walking through the motions of what has to be done at meetings, but you're really kind of getting that good input from a variety of members and making people feel comfortable to speak up. Concluding the meeting with action items, so assigning tasks to committees or individuals as you're ending the meeting, and then checking in between board meetings to make sure that people have what they need to do what they're going to be doing. And so a lot of times if you kind of build in that accountability between meetings, it can really help to develop and engage those board members. You also want to be on the lookout for board members who show aptitude for and interest in leadership roles, because this can really help the succession of your board as you move forward. And giving them an opportunity to try out different roles through assignments or projects can be very helpful and can overall just build your board capacity and build those opportunities for your agency. You really want to figure out and know what every board member has to offer, what value they can bring, to discover how best to maximize what each has to offer. And so that's a quote that comes from a board source resource on building the governance partnership, the Chief Executive's Guide to Getting the Most from the Board. So we recommend that for those of you who are looking into this topic to help build that governance partnership as you're developing your board members. So with strategic agendas, looking at your board meeting agenda is important as well. You really want to make sure you strike a balance between routine agenda items, so that might be contract approvals, you know, the different financial pieces, that kind of thing, and those larger strategy discussions. So you want to consider using a consent agenda for those routine items, and then making sure that you're really being strategic around what is included on those agendas so you're able to have those more big picture discussions as well. You want to think about how will agenda items and information be provided to board members to help the board connect with the organization's mission, enhance board functioning, provide oversight, as well as identify and make decisions on key issues. And so really being able to have those strategic discussions whenever you're developing the agenda, you know, between the board chair and the executive director to make sure that, you know, all of these things are being considered and that you're not just kind of copying and pasting items on the agendas. Another thing is you want to make sure you're looking at calendars as far as making sure you're looking up at the calendars ahead of time, so you're able to put items on there that need to be approved for the organizational standards, making sure that you're building in enough preparation time and being proactive about maybe strategic planning or the community needs assessment or those big items that the agency does over time, to make sure that you're discussing those in enough advance to give the agency what they need to be able to move forward on those items in good time. And then also consider using dashboards. So whether it be a financial dashboard or an overall strategic dashboard that's associated with the strategic plan, these can be very helpful so that the agency can kind of get a snapshot of what's happening, or the board can get that snapshot of what's happening in the agency. And then they can also provide that good discussion too. So you can see where you know, you're meeting those strategic objectives. You can see where you know, financial, you know, where, you know, budgets are and all those financial pieces are at, so that then you can have those needed discussions and also see what's good, you know, what's up and coming, what's lacking, that sort of thing. So here's a resource from the National Council of Nonprofits talking about what might need to be included on those traditional board agendas versus a strategic agenda. So you can kind of use those as examples to examine your own board agendas in your agency. Then the strategic dashboards that I mentioned, you know, again, these can just be helpful to give that snapshot of what's going on and provide a starting point for discussion for the board. So there's lots of different ways to do this. And we're actually collecting some examples right now at the Community Action Partnership on dashboards, whether it be financial and or comprehensive. A lot of times we encourage an agency to have a comprehensive dashboard, you know, that includes all of these different pieces, since so many of them are interconnected. But if your agency has a good example of a strategic dashboard, we would be interested in seeing those. So one way to look at the dashboard piece as well as how to act on it is this dual bottom line. And this is also, there's, you know, the, this comes from the nonprofit sustainability. So there's a book that's associated with this that looks at basically the matrix here that you see on your screen that looks at sustainability and impact. And so you're looking at what is your mission impact, you know, through different programs in your agency, and then what is the financial return on that. And so you can actually do this matrix mapping process to determine, you know, what are those high impact programs that also are very sustainable, and then where are we maybe having some of those programs that are not sustainable or not having a huge impact, towards our strategic goals, you know, and then really making sure that either we're enhancing those different programs that might need more impact or sustainability, or maybe those are some that eventually we might need to go ahead and close or spin off elsewhere, so that we're not wasting resources and time and energy on that. So as you can see from this matrix here, you know, there's this high mission impact but low profitability. So you might want to keep that because it has that high mission impact, but make sure you contain those costs because it's not really making that much of a you know, sustainable impact on your agency. Then there's the stars, which is also high mission impact, but also high profitability or high sustainability. And so those are the ones that you really want to invest and grow with those programs and services because you know, those are doing well. And so you want to make sure that you're investing those resources into those and keeping those going. Then you might also have in one of the lower quadrants where the trees are, where you have low mission impact and high profitability. So this might be things like your fundraisers, you know, maybe different charity events that you have where really it doesn't have a huge impact to your mission, but it is very helpful in sustaining your organization. So those might be things that you want to think, well, how can we maybe help that to have more of an impact so that we can maybe move that into that upper quadrant as well. And then there's going to be some that you might look at that have low mission impact and low profitability. And then those are ones you might want to consider if there's a way to move it into another quadrant, that'd be great. But if not, ultimately, sometimes you have to make those tough decisions to determine whether it's something to keep spending that time and resources on. So there's a book associated with this, but we would recommend looking into this. This is something good for the board to consider as you're looking at both financials and program impact. So strategies for board retention, a recap on this, make sure you're clear about board responsibilities during recruitment. Make sure you're providing adequate orientation and training, especially on those board basics. And then make sure you're actively soliciting input from new members and being intentional about providing opportunities to participate. So having those good discussions one-on-one can really help to get that input going over time as well. Using mentors can also be good. We mentioned that. Using press and social media to recognize contributions of new board members, so getting that recognition out there a little bit. Thinking about the extras, so childcare, meals, what are some of those barriers that prevent board members to coming to your meetings, and how can you take those away or help with that barrier at the board meeting. And then conducting those board assessments to identify challenges and concerns and making sure that you are improving over time based on where you're at currently. All right, so we have a few more minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about keeping the board fresh as we close. I'm not seeing any questions that have come in at this point, although I do see a couple of hands that are raised. So just want to remind you all, if you can type in the chat box, there should be a chat bubble towards the end of your screen. And I'm going to go ahead and type in the chat box. Just please type in any questions here, because sometimes it kind of hides from you until somebody makes a chat. But you can go ahead and type your questions in there since everyone is muted on your end. But I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about keeping the board fresh, and then we'll circle back to questions at the end. So board size. A lot of times board size can be very important, and we've heard a lot from boards around the nation lately that boards are actually, talking about that maybe their board is too big, and so they're looking at how do we make sure that we have a representative board as far as our service area and the tripartite requirements, but that we don't get too big. And so some agencies are working to shrink the size of their boards a little bit as well. So looking at board size, deciding on the right number of board members, and having these discussions, not like every meeting, of course, but having these discussions every so often. Do we have the right size board? What is the right size board? The federal CSBG Act does not actually address board size, but some states' CSBG law or their regulations do impose board size requirements. So before you have this discussion, you always want to make sure that you are in line with your state's laws and regulations, as well as look and see what it says in your bylaws. But of course, with your own bylaws, you can always work to address that if you feel like your agency is not needing to have that size of board anymore. But federal CSBG Act does not require a specific size, but make sure you look at your state or local laws just in case. As far as board members' terms, the federal CSBG Act does not address term limits for board members either. Bylaws should state the board members' terms, though. So if the bylaws are silent on this, the state nonprofit corporation law might set a default term. So it could be, the example could be a year. What we're seeing a lot of kind of happening over time with community action agency boards is that there's not necessarily a term limit, or the term limit is potentially too long. And so there's instances where board members are on the board for a couple decades. And so with that, there's lots of different ways to kind of get around that, possibly by making sure that maybe there's a term limit and then there's kind of that cooling off period where they're still kind of in the queue to maybe come back on the board at some point, especially if they were a good board member. But that you kind of build in those opportunities to let fresh board members come on from time to time as well. So you just want to make sure you're having these discussions both on size as well as board member terms, and then that the bylaws state whatever is the agreed upon term limit. But federal CSBG Act does not state a specific term limit for community action agency board members. So I talked about this a little bit, but you might provide those staggered terms or having that cooling off period. So mixing in new and experienced board members. Terms can be different lengths for different sectors. So if you're seeing that it's much harder to recruit for a certain term, or for a certain sector rather, you might, allow that term length to be a little bit longer. But, also just making sure that it makes sense on how you have those potentially staggered, or what the different lengths for different sectors are. Then 3-year terms is one that we've seen as pretty common for nonprofit boards. So that might be a starting place, and then just see how that works for your organization. But we suggest not having it too long, because that kind of the fresh board members can be very impactful. And again, having that governance committee that's ongoing and working on development and recruitment can help to make sure that you're able to fill those vacancies when they do happen. So if the state law does not specify term limits, the community action agency board members may serve for a number of successive terms. Individual community action agencies may decide to have term limits, and some agencies permit board members who have reached their term limit to rejoin the board after a break. So that's that cooling period that I was talking about that can be used with term limits as well. And then removal of board members. So this isn't always a comfortable topic, but it's something that's important to talk about, because you want to make sure that you're not having board members stay on the board too long when they're not contributing to the board, and somebody that might be able to contribute more could potentially fill their spot. Because a lot of times whenever you're getting stagnant boards, this is part of that issue, is because you have people on there that have maybe been on there for too long, maybe aren't invested in the work anymore, whatever the cause might be. But you want to make sure that you're keeping the board fresh, and sometimes removal of board members is part of that. So you want to specify whether removal can be without cause or whether it must be for cause. So always being proactive about these things. If it has to be for cause, you want to define or give examples of what that cause might be in the bylaws. So again, this needs to be written down in the bylaws. You also want to use that term including but not limited to, just to make sure that you're not locked into only, a couple of different causes, but giving those examples so people know up front what that, could mean. Also specifying whether a vote would be needed to remove the board members. So making sure that is written in the bylaws as well. So a recommendation here is that you could consider including strong removal positions in bylaws and use them if necessary. All right. Well, that is kind of the end of our training content for today, but what I'm going to do is check the questions now because I think I've seen a couple come in. Okay, so it looks like Hope asked a question about term limits, and I think I addressed that through what I just talked about. So yes, I mean, 3 years would be kind of the recommended term limit that, is most recommended for nonprofit boards. Another question, is there information available to determine executive director overreach in board governance? I might have to get back to you on that one as far as the overreach part. I'm sure that there is some information out there. And I know that we have a couple resources on board and executive director, the relationship there. So it goes deeper into that segment I did on the training today. There's actually a resource called Dynamic Duo, and that one should be on both the partnership website as well as the CAPLAW website. It was created a few years ago. That might be one resource to look in as far as executive director overreach. It might address some of those different roles that are pretty specific between the two. Another question, should an executive director have input in board size and composition? So I think this would be, I mean, it would probably need to be somewhat of a discussion. And, I think that the executive director and the board chair could definitely, discuss that. I don't know that, in the meeting, it kind of depends on, I think, the agency. But the dynamic duo might be a good resource for that as well. And you can also email us and we can get you further information on that as well. Let's see. So how involved should the executive director be in board meetings and discussion? For example, should the executive director plan or schedule board meetings or trainings? The executive director should definitely do it in conjunction with the board. I mean, I think that a lot of boards look to the executive director for certain training topics and things like that, which I think is fine, and those can be recommended to the board and encouraged for the board. But the executive director shouldn't be doing it on their own. So I think that, it would definitely need to be in conjunction with the board chair and with the board. Let's see. Does the requirement of 1/3 low-income representation stand for the executive committee and board at large? So, I mean, the 1/3 low-income representation, I believe, is just for the entire board. We can clarify that with you if you email us that question. But the executive committee, I don't think, has to be made up of the same composition as the board. But I might be wrong on that. So go ahead and email us on that one. Okay, so will this slideshow be available after the event? Yes, so we'll make the recording as well as the slides available after the event. And so those will be available online, but you can also email me at ckohler@communityactionpartnership.com. I'll go back to the beginning slide here in just a moment, and so you can see that email. Another question was, after the 3-year term limit, do the board members have to sit out for a while, or can they be re-elected for another term? I think that's up to your agency. So as long as you have determined that, make sure you look at any state laws or anything that might be in place. But again, the federal CSBG Act does not require certain, regulations around term limit. So it would be up to your agency to establish those and write them in the bylaws. But then, if you would want a board member to come back on after they sit out from that cooling period, that is possible. But you would want to make sure that that is agreed upon for your agency, written in your bylaws, and that it obviously coincides with any state regulations that could be present for you. All right, I think that's all the questions that I see. So thank you all for joining us today. I'll go back to the beginning slide so that you all have my email as well as Jarl Crocker's email. Definitely feel free to email us at any time. We will be getting the slides as well as the recording on the web in the next couple of days. Most of our staff is out at events this week. We're doing our Immigration Summit in El Paso, Texas, and I'm going to be at the ROMA in-service in Oklahoma, so it might be towards the end of the week by the time we get it online. So if you want the slides or recording before that, please just email me, and I'm happy to send those over to you. But feel free again to ask us any questions via email, and thank you all for joining us today. Have a good day.